Good afternoon, everyone, and to our colleagues next door and those who are streaming and watching us virtually. Looking at the program over the last 2 days, I've looked and I've seen researchers, academics, NGOs, teachers, people from government presenting and looking at the complexities of literacy and learning. We're taking a bit of a turn in this session, and if we think about joining the dots, or if we think about it in another way, the sum of all the parts. And this session is going to look at collaboration. And I was thinking about collaboration, and I'm sure if I took a poll, everyone would say, yes, we need to collaborate. The challenge is so great, we need to collaborate. Yet, it's complex. It's rewarding, but complex. So we've got 4 panelists here with me, each bringing perspectives about collaboration. We're going to do it in the form of a conversation. I'm going to give each panelist 5 minutes, and that's the only time I'll get formal. I'll stand up when your 5 minutes are up. And then we're going to have a conversation between us about examples of collaboration. What are some of the enablers? What are some of the hindrances or hurdles that we need to get over? And it's really reflecting the theme of the conference around joining the dots. So first, I'm going to hand over to Pumi. We're not going to do long introductions. Our bios are all in the program, and I hope it's going to be okay. While we speak, we'll have our masks off, and we allowed only Mpumi to have a few slides because she's going to frame our conversation for us. Okay, over to you, Mpumi.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to stand here because I think for live streaming you want to see both the presentation and hear me. So firstly, I just want to make sure that we all understand the schooling sector in South Africa. We have about 13 million children in school, and that makes up 22% of the country's population. So schooling is a big deal. We are 1/5 of what constitutes this country. 95% of children are in public schools. So unlike the rest of the African continent, private schools in South Africa are a very small number. They are the 5%. In other contexts, it's the other way around. And of these 95% of public schools, the vast majority, almost 80% of them, are what we classify as quintile 1 to 3 schools. This is no fee paying schools. Then moving on from that, last year, because of COVID, extended closures, especially in grade 1 to 6, we lost about 60% of the school year. This is like long blocks of closure. If you remember, we closed in March and the last grades went back in August. And then once they were back in school, a lot of them were in rotational attendance. When we asked teachers in a sample of 250 schools what their typical rotation was, for most it was 3 days a week or 2 days a week. So if you are on a 3-day cycle this week, next week you're on a 2-day cycle. So effectively children were getting only half of schooling within a month. And so once you've counted the number of days lost, 196, and then you add rotational timetabling once they were back in school, last year we lost about 60% of schooling. If you move that on to this year, we've had much fewer disruptions. We've had limited long closures. We had that 2-week delay at the beginning of the school, but not much in terms of disruption. Even in that context, which is better than 2021, if you take into consideration that term 1 and 2 was still rotational attendance, we've still continued to be losing teaching time. What does teaching time mean in terms of learning loss? I'll explain this. Go with me one at a time. This part just says, before COVID-19, South Africa was participating in several international assessments. the Pearl study, SACMEC on the continent, as well as TIMS. And South Africa was on a exceedingly impressive trajectory. We were improving at one of the most rapid speeds in terms of improvement in outcomes. We were still at the bottom, but we were not inactive. It's not a flat line. We've been improving. So then what happened with COVID? This is from a NITS Prime study. What you're seeing here is the start of grade 1. These are children that did not have COVID. This is 2019. They're at the end of grade 1. They're at the end of grade 2. They know 46 letters. This is a second cohort that was affected by COVID. It's actual real data. This is them at the end of grade 1, at the end of grade 2. Essentially, not being in school in 2020 changed the trajectory of those children. They are not on the same trajectory. They didn't learn the 46 letters they could have learned at the end of grade 2. They lost about 10 letters. So that's one way of quantifying what's been lost. A second way of quantifying the same thing, this is the last slide, is looking at how many words children learned. When we assess children here, they've learned 13 words at the end of grade 2, 22 words at the end of grade 3. We assess those same learners, and they only learned a word or two in 2020. This is a year of learning loss. So essentially, these children who were in grade 4 in 2020 were effectively at the same level as they had been a year ago. That means they've lost almost a full year of learning. When we compare them in similar comparable words that we've done in 2 different provinces, they should have been at least 31 words. What does that mean if we want to quantify it? It means we've lost about 80% of a year of learning in 2020 if we go to this and compare it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mpumi. And when we get to our conversations, Mpumi and the director that she's part of do the work they do in collaboration with provinces, universities, and donors. So I'm going to ask you to reflect on some of those experiences. I'm going to hand over to Mary now, who needs no introduction amongst us in terms of her work. And Mary, essentially the way you work is both collaborative and consultatively. And you're going to continue from Mpumi, talking about the need for collaboration. Thanks, Gail.
So nice to take the mask off for a second. Thank you very much, Gail. I want to just talk firstly about the problem that needs to be solved and why we need to collaborate. And I know that Mpumi has given us a very strong basis to say, what is that problem? And we know that the learning loss is going to be detrimental for all other learning. We know from what Mpumi has said and from all of your experience that we do already start from a low base in reading. Of course, numeracy as well, but I'm focusing on literacy. We are not where we wanted to be. And that was true in 2020 of February of 2020, and now it's worse. The implications of that are just so huge because everybody here doesn't need to be persuaded that reading is the foundational skill for all other learning. From foundation phase into the grade 4 and into secondary is if learners can't read in the medium of instruction, it just makes it impossible for them to really benefit from the time that they have available, and certainly it means that they can't read independently. So we have what I would call a burning platform. It's evident to anyone in the country that we have to get literacy right, which is why it's so good to be with all of you who are passionate about literacy. So we have a burning platform. We should have consensus that we have to act. That's why the collaborations that we're going to speak about in this panel are so very important. I would say that my wish, and I am quite explicitly going to say that I think UTASA is going to be a key partner in any collaboration. My wish is that we can persuade the people who drive curriculum planning and thinking in the DBE nationally to prioritize reading in primary school, at least, if not in the early grades of high school. I would be able to, on the basis of what Mpumi has said, argue that in any forum. So if we're going to be able to say we have to prioritize reading, we have to, and whenever I say literacy, if I was in a maths conference, I'd also be saying numeracy, but we are people who are thinking about reading. So how do we, well, firstly, I hope everyone agrees with that. Let me be cheeky and say, put up your hand. Is there anybody who agrees that reading has to be a focus in primary school? I'm putting both. So the only person who can't put up their hand is the man who's doing the filming. So everybody else agrees.
I can't read anyway.
We have to do it. So how do we use collaboration to achieve that at different levels? So I would say, firstly, the other speakers are going to talk about why collaboration is important and pitfalls and how we get there. But if we've got a burning platform on which we all agree, then how do we do the collaboration in a way that goes beyond just lamenting? And one of my favorite phrases, as Gail knows, is magical thinking. You know, we've agreed, we've spoken, therefore it's going to happen. Collaboration means that it's got to be made practical, and that's again why the task is so important. But I'm very conscious that in amplifying our contribution, there's an individual level and there's a collective level where the use of the knowledge we have as individuals as well as collectively can have different forms of impact and different forms of organization, depending on where we choose to put our energies. So in understanding Latasa, I understand there's academics, there's NGOs, there's people who provide, there's individual people who are passionate about reading. So firstly, to maximize impact, we have to work collectively. We have to be able to pool our resources in order to share that understanding at system level. But that doesn't mean that if we get lost within a whole organization, there's not work that we can do individually as NGOs, as teachers, as people who care. Are you looking at me for time? Oh, okay. Let me leave that hanging. There's work that we can do as individuals at different levels within the system. Maximizing the partnerships that we make. Maybe not with the DBE, but even with a school governing body, with a professional learning community. But collaboration is an important way of maximizing our efforts so that we can address this burning platform. Thank you, Gail.
Thanks, Mary. Was my stay that bad? I'm going to hand over to Andile now, and Andile is going to speak from a funder perspective. And if we look at some of the reports that come out, funders, whether it's corporates, business, or private philanthropy or international funding that comes into the country, spend about 3 billion per annum. And so the real big question is, why are those funders, and 80% of them work in education, why don't we see more collaboration amongst them? And Andile, you've worked with me in a private philanthropy organization, you've worked for a corporate, and now you're in the role at UNICEF, where you are in the business of brokering these funding partnerships and working with government. So let me hand over to you for some of your reflections.
Thank you, Gail, and good afternoon, everyone. It's quite a critical subject to be tackling, particularly having learned of the context of COVID and what COVID has taught us. When Kulula started speaking here, she outlined the roles of different sectors and different role players in the education sector. Just in 2020, Trialogue outlined the amount of money that donors bring in for development in South Africa, and I think that was around 10 billion in 2020. 2021 stats seems to be a little bit different and higher because of COVID. Of that, 51% goes into education. Is this fine? Fine? I actually do it better when I'm singing. 51% of that goes into education. However, impact in education is not felt as much as the money that goes in. But COVID-19 has taught us that actually more and more organizations needs to work together. It's not happening as much as we'd like to, and there's a number of reasons for that. Reasons or barriers to working together will stem from a number of things. Firstly, we work with mostly non-governmental organizations, and most organizations are really not willing to be working together at face value. And how do we create platforms to ensure that organizations are willing to share their expertise, to work together, to go together when they are looking for funding, and to present a very clear model or what they want to change. But there's another area that comes from the funder side. Funders work differently, so private organizations work differently compared to NGOs and private philanthropists compared to multinational organizations. For example, if you look at organizations that are private, their principles around funding or become different. So some organization might want to fund because of brand prominency. Some organization might want to fund small scale projects. Some organizations might want to fund large scale or systemic projects. Some funders might want to fund different models of work, and beliefs around what will cause change in education might be different. Some organization might believe that reading for leisure is what is going to be the lever in education, while some organizations might believe that, for an example, the work that the DBE is leading on 8th grade reading around structured learning is what is going to change the needle. So complexities become clearing when those principles or foundations of what it takes to change the system are brought into the fore. So when we think about collaborations, we think about how do we make sure that we're in mainly alignment of what is going to cause the change, but also in cases where we are not, we are clearer of where we are moving from and what we are going to be doing. The third component is some organizations work in line with all of the national and international instruments that were outlined earlier. So if we are not aligned with the priorities that government is trying to address, or we are not aligned in the goals that we want to support, it becomes very difficult to collaborate. So how about when we are thinking about collaboration as both the beneficiaries, which I have been at some point, or when we are funders, we begin by outlining what is it that we are trying to change and what we agree on and what we do not agree on, and then work on evidence to support what we do not agree on, and so that alignment becomes easier. And last, I don't have more time, but I think we'll have more engagement. Gail, your look is best.
So I'm going to hand over to Colleen now. And Colleen, I mean, you saw when I started, I said, yes, we want to collaborate. When Mary asked the question, do we believe that reading is what we should be promoting? And yet you've been learning some of the complexities. And Colleen and the organization RIOS have worked in multi-stakeholder collaborations, not only in South Africa, but on the continent. And you're going to give us your perspective on collaboration and how some of these complexities, difficulties have been managed.
Thanks, Gail. And I'm going to make your job easier and time myself, just so that otherwise I might run out of, I might speak too long. So it's great to be here. And as Gail mentioned, my work primarily is about bringing groups together. I work in situations where people don't agree or like or trust each other, but they have to work together. So what have we learned about collaboration when that exists? This group seems to like and trust and want to work together, but of course there are complexities and different interests and different powers at play. So I thought I'd maybe start with not talking directly to the literacy challenge, but talking to what we're learning about collaboration and seeing which might apply to these complexities. And I'm going to suggest that we think about collaboration as the act of removing obstacles. So what are the obstacles that we need to remove in order to address the challenge? And I'm going to talk to 3 high-level ones, and then we can look at how they play out in the literacy situation. The first obstacle that we've found in our work is this myth. These are all myths. This myth that we have to agree. So what we try to do in particularly these sort of high-stakes contested situations is to map out where we disagree and to say, let's acknowledge that we all have different interests. We sit in the same system, but from very different vantage points. So we prioritize things differently. And that then comes across to others as disagreement or being problematic. But if we look at it systemically, if we map the system and say, this is maybe how we look at it differently, it's much easier to find out where we agree, rather than the other way around, where we use these general statements like, yes, we agree that literacy has to be a priority. Because then it's hard to break down from that point. So start with realizing that we don't have to agree. We don't have to like each other. We don't have to be friends, but we have to work together. And what will enable that to happen? The second myth or obstacle that we work with is this notion that we have to have a plan, that we have to know exactly what to do. In unprecedented situations, and these days everything's unprecedented, you cannot work with the assumption that we're going to develop a master plan together. It just slows things down way too much. So what we work with is how do we experiment our way forward, which is the act of collaborating, testing, learning, and quickly adjusting and scaling. It's a cycle of letting go of what's not working quickly at lower risk, and then scaling. And that act of collaborating is the act that Mary spoke about, of actually the practicalities, like we have to do stuff together, but we might get it wrong. So let's learn about it and set up the cycles of learning to quickly adjust. And then the third obstacle is that if only the other person changed, or if only they did it like we do it. That is probably the deepest level of resistance or obstacle, is to think that that the problem is outside of yourself or your organization, especially in unprecedented situations. There are old patterns of thinking, of programming that you have to let go of, and it's difficult. And so that level of introspection only comes in an environment where you've got some trust. And people can give you feedback, because you can't assess yourself and your own organization. And you're able to take it without taking it personally. What do we need to? And this is where relationships with donors is so important. To have that sort of trusting relationship, to both experiment but also look at yourself quite critically, and how are you an obstacle to the system that is not aware to you. So those are the three obstacles I think that we can work with And I'll just mention a brief example and then close. Over a period of 2 years, we brought a group of 40 leaders together to address the challenge or the slow-paced land reform. This was in 2014, 2015. And at the time, I mean, it still is contested, but at the time it was, there were lots of new policy changes. It was creating quite a lot of anxiety in the system and a lot of conflict. And one way we found quite helpful to practice these three removing of obstacles is instead of dealing with the problem directly, we had the group think about what might happen in the future. And once they were able to see each other's sort of mental models about what might happen in the future, it aligned their thinking for collaboration today. So there are many methods that we can use to do this. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thanks, Gail.
Well, thanks to the panelists for kicking us off. And I'm going to start and maybe put this to Mpumi and Mary. There's the perception that it's very difficult to work with government. So I know in terms of your work and in terms of Mpumi, and talk to us about the partnerships that you've structured with other stakeholders. Just one or two things that you feel that's made them work.
Sure. So I think touching on what Colleen said first around having to agree, I think that's the first thing that hinders or enables partnerships or collaboration. I think thinking from a system level being at the national office, right? So the collaborations we want to be part of at that level, if you think of the 30 million children I spoke about, are collaborations that are scalable. These are collaborations that will not make a difference in one school or 5 schools or 10 schools, but where there's been enough proof of concept that I can believe, and in ethical research, you, the researcher, need to believe this thing that you're going to be doing. So believe that it can make a difference in 100 schools or 1,000 schools, etc. That's a different collaboration to the one you can have in a district or a circuit or within a school. And I think that sometimes is the difference, that some innovations or interventions are still at the 1 school, 5 school, 10 school, but we're trying to do them at the 10,000 school aspect. And I think that's probably the biggest area where we differ. But we've been able to collaborate quite successfully recently on reading benchmarks for African languages. So what's happened there is there's been an early grade reading study from 2015 where interventions were being tested to support reading in home language in Northwest. But to measure impact, there's been this consistent data collection. So longitudinal data, these same children that were assessed in grade 1, 2, 3, they're now in grade 7, they're being assessed as we speak. That has given us, that was not the intention. The intention wasn't to have this long-term 7-year data set. The intention was to try an innovation for a year where Zenex and UNICEF were actually very early adopters. The only 2 funders who believed in this little study that would work. We're now at a scale where I think we probably have 8 or 9 funders who are now coming in and being part of this coalition. What that data has allowed us, though, is to say it's very hard to, in grade 1, know what children should be reading. It's much easier to assess one comprehension in grade 6, but you needed to assess grade 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6. And now in grade 6 say, oh, the ones who are reading successfully needed to have known 20 words in grade 1. And so through this sort of foresight, visionary support from funders, we've now been able to lobby and create these benchmarks that started off in 1 language and that are now going to be, well, exist now for Nguni languages. Not the intention of the initial study. Now people are coming alongside and saying, we want to fund this for Tsonga, we want to fund this for Tshivenda. And the collaboration has then gone from South African private donors to multinationals to CSIs to linguists in universities that we have historically not worked with. I learned a lot about Sebedi recently in Limpopo. to that kind of like becoming a sector issue that we all understand. We've all been able to communicate and clarify what we're measuring, and then we've been able to collaborate. And I think at this stage would be where we would want NGOs, teachers, school principals taking it on, because those kinds of collaborations are useless if those benchmarks end up on my computer. And we can come here and tell you we have benchmarks that you've never seen and are not using. So that kind of, I think that's what for me is important for collaboration. Seeing an opportunity, we keep thinking and innovating on that opportunity and strengthening it, keep bringing along new people, and then also think through who's going to use these in the end and get them to come along. Thanks.
So I'm going to reflect on my experience with Philo, who works with the KwaZulu-Natal Department of Education, supporting them to implement a program called Jikumfundo, without going into the elements of what that is about. Picking up what Mpobi said, design for scale at a cost that the system can afford. Because to imagine possibilities that are not implementable on scale, we can learn from them, but government won't be able to adopt them. And a principle we've always worked on is you have to locate responsibility where responsibility will remain in order for the initiative to be sustained. It's a very strong sentence, and I have it drilled in my head, and I have to remember it all of the time. So when you work with government, I think for me, there's two key categories of that working with. There's working with in terms of policy and implementable, scalable policy, and the resource that comes is the knowledge, the shared learning. But there's also partnerships in terms of implementation on the basis of policy. So where we collaborate with government, and that's all of us, provincially, district, school, it has to be within policy. Because otherwise you are undermining the prior process of policy development, and you might have fabulous ideas, but to ask schools to do something that is outside of the policy framework is difficult for them. So where you have to start, whether it's at a school or in a circuit or a district, is do we agree on the problem and do we agree on the solutions, and are we prepared to invest the effort that will take to drive the change? I'm not going to look at Gail. So the closing point that I want to make, and it builds on what Colleen was saying, is that when we appoint people into PILO in a leadership position, the one characteristic, other than things like integrity, which are non-negotiable for me, we look for people who have low ego. I don't need to explain that because I can hear people recognizing. If you dominantly about your excelling, you easily become, rather than a support, you become a competitor with everyone. So we're here to learn and support the implementation. Thank you, Gail.
Thanks, Mary. Andile, you spoke about some of the complexities of donors working together, and Pumi said we're working together on a program, but we've also worked on other projects where there hasn't been agreement on issues, and I'm reflecting on what you said about building trust. Okay. How can some of that trust be built, even if we disagree on certain areas?
I can just think of some of the projects that nature again.
But we're not difficult people. Or ego-driven.
No comment. We actually are not. I think what has been always critical is in everything that we do, we put the child at the core of what we're doing. Once you remember that, the egos and the complexities are manageable when you go back and constantly remember why you do what you do. So that's the first part on the ego part. But there has been context where collaboration has been so complex, and ways of dealing with that when the trust has been shaken is to go back and think about, one, the objectives of the project. You go back and say, why do we do this project? And then secondly, you think about the type of collaboration that you want to build. There are different types of collaboration. You can collaborate for networking, for coordination. You can collaborate to put funding together or to bring in technical expertise. You have to go back to that. But more importantly, clarifying the roles and the responsibilities has been at the heart of how you deal with complexities in collaboration. I can think of some of the projects where you collaborate and there are challenges, and then you have to go back and say, what is the role of each of the partners sitting at the table? Who is the leader? Who is the final decision maker? Who signs the contract where there are contracts? Who deals with the issues of communication? Who has the final say should issues be of complexity? So you deal with issues of roles and responsibilities. You put together mechanisms for management and governance of whatever the partnership is about. So you ensure that there is a governance structure, you ensure that there's a management structure. In most cases, especially for UNICEF, and it has happened with the Xenex also, you want to make sure that there's a government representative and a government person who's accountable and who leads the project, because at some stage you need to institutionalize. We found that communication, and more communication is very critical when you get to a point when you think trust is a little shaky and you want to rebuild the trust, but you also want to be able to succeed in the process. So you decide when to communicate, about what you want to communicate, how often do you want to communicate, and in cases where there's barrier in communication, who do you bring in to help broker the communication which might have broken, and you rebuild that trust that Colleen is talking about. So collaborations are not going to be successful if you have not put the fundamentals on the table, if you have not dealt with issues of communications, if you have not dealt with issues of clarifying the objectives and why you want to collaborate, and remembering to put the child at the center. Gail, you also spoke about area government and the role of government and working with government and how difficult it is. And some of the challenges with collaboration lies there at the heart of how you want to work with government and your principles about working with government, and what do you believe about what the role of government is and how government should be approached. But once that has been dealt with in a partnership or in a collaboration structure, you are able to then build other shaky areas around trust, around communication, and around how you want to implement your programs.
Okay. Can I add something? Okay, so one aspect just struck me when you spoke, and I'm sure Kulida will confirm. One of the challenges with working with government is there is a reality of procurement, right? And that comes with national treasury, right? And regulations. And the tension of, I have a great idea and I'm selling you something. And then what happens there in fair competition? How do I, as someone managing a budget, decide to fund this? Should this have been a tender, etc.? So I think it's not just relational or scalability, etc. It's also we operate within quite a rigid, very rigid set of rules that are managed externally for the sake of fairness and to stop corruption. Unfortunately, that's the reality.
Thanks for that reflection, Mpumi. I'm going to put out two realities and ask Colleen, how would you deal with them if people are in the room? People who come with funding have power. It's inherent because what drives an intervention is money. And then you have non-profit organizations who are driven by values and wanting to do something, but there's also competition between them for this funding. Now, if you have those kinds of contestations in a room, how do you manage those power dynamics?
Easy question.
Yeah, I think the easy one for Colleen.
So I want to speak about what happens before you bring people into a room, because that's actually more important than once you bring people together. And we pay a lot of attention to this concept called convening, which is when a group of people realize that, and I'm going to paint it in quite stark language. This, in a way, I kind of want to bring it back to the burning platform. This isn't a nice to have. It's not what people want to do. It feels nice to collaborate, but the kind of collaboration that we're talking about here is hard, and it's beyond your mandate of your own organization. So we only collaborate if it's unsustainable not to. Think about it like that. That actually we will go backwards if we don't collaborate. So which is the situation at the moment, which we saw from the stats. That convening, we call it quiet convening, that happens beforehand, is so important to balance power and what we call, as much as possible. We never say a situation is ideal or safe, but it's safe enough for people to come along. So how can you set up the funding, the decision-making about that funding in a way that people don't feel manipulated or co-opted into a process? And that requires lots of one-on-one and negotiation, and it probably comes before. If I just reflect on what Mpumi was saying about the constraints of government, I think these kinds of convening processes can happen before you go to government. It's kind of testing the proof of concept and getting the trust and the governance structure set up properly beforehand. So who convenes? Typically, we make sure that the voice, people aren't speaking on behalf of institutions or sectors that they're not part of. That there's, there's always more than one funder, and there's 3 or 4 convening parties that can reach the whole system, and then to bring people together. So that's kind of how we would do it. And then in the room, just the building on the trust thing, what we always start with, and we can debate this, particularly when things are urgent, is to build a shared reality of what is, not what we want. Because it's in the assessment of what is that you see all the differences, and that builds the trust. Because then you're like, gosh, that person's experience, I had no idea that sector or that bit of information is happening and how they're running into problems. And we find you move very quickly if you've got a shared sense of what is, not where you want to go, which is why I'm not a big fan of strategic planning in these situations. It's fine in when it's status quo and we can control what's happening out there, but plans come quite quickly once you understand the shared reality of what's going on.
I mean, Colleen, in saying that, I think it's also a message to people who fund work in the education space, because often funders want to know how many people have you reached, how many workshops have you had, and this important building relationships, and the convening role is important that you speak about. Mary, we've been talking organizationally and about stakeholders, but I want to ask you, at a school level and between schools, how can teachers collaborate with each other? I mean, for me, you spoke about ultimately the use of the work you're doing.
Yeah. That's a fabulous question, because I think it's actually the solution to the resource constraints across the system. Working in KZN, the possibility of subject advisors meaningfully responding to the challenges of teaching and learning, you just need to look at the ratio of subject advisors there, foundation phase or GT phase, and there's very little possibility of real support. We designed Jikumfundo with a sense that the head of department was going to be able to play a key role, which they must in terms of curriculum management. But in terms of teacher support, HODs or department heads have the same teaching load as a teacher and very little time to actually engage with teachers. And also department heads other than foundation phase are responsible for subjects in which they're not expert. We can't depend on external support to schools within the resource constraints. And I'm saying something maybe people are going to want to disagree with me on. What we have to do, I believe, is even within the weakest schools, get teachers in professional learning communities that are their colleagues within the school to support each other. It's crucial that we have professional supportive conversations between colleagues based on the evidence of learners learning so that people can find solutions. Now, that's not going to catapult the system forward, but it's the most realistic way of proceeding now. And that gives an opportunity for organizations and individuals who see the big politics that's been spoken about as a little bit outside of their reach. Because as an individual, as an NGO, it's possible to form collaborations at school level with teachers to say, how can I help you in this task you have of supporting each other? Obviously, that also goes through to system level, but it gives all of us a way in of supporting teachers.
Andile, Colleen raised the point of the convening, and you were talking about in the process of intervening and collaboration, there needs to be governance structures, there needs to be ongoing communication. And I often find that it's just expected to happen. So what are some of the other aspects around funding that need to go into a collaboration other than the intervention?
Other than the intervention, let's use the context of COVID and the lessons that we have learned there. In the space of COVID, South Africa gets hit in 2016, schools close. There has to be emergency response. Different funders have different areas of priority which they want to fund. So each of the organization will select an intervention, so multiple interventions towards emergency response. South Africa had to quickly put together a steering committee that will look at how do we work together even though the interventions are not the same. So some interventions would be around the continuation of learning. Some of the intervention would be around creating safe learning environments. Some intervention would be around continuation of learning at home and some at school. So it's different interventions, but you have to sit together and collaborate so that you address issues of emergency response. And what South Africa or that group was able to do is to say for each of the areas of work, what are the different interventions that are supposed to be happening. But we also had to think about in the process of implementing, how do we monitor, what are we contributing towards and what are we doing? how do we share lessons learned or capture lessons and share lessons, because as you can imagine, COVID-19 and COVID-19 response was almost a moving cycle. We had a whole lot that we didn't know about COVID-19. We had little evidence about different areas of COVID-19. We had different experiences around how to quickly learn and get into a mode of improving the different interventions that were being implemented. So what worked, Gail, was after creating the platforms for that collaboration in different interventions, we had to be able to then say, let's put together a monitoring plan, but let's also put together structures and systems to ensure that we continue to correct as we go. But we also still had to say how many people we were reaching. We had to make sure that we ensure that all 13 million children are reached. We had to also, as much as we were going, create platforms for learning and improvement of the program. So other than the governance structure, other than the communication, you have to be able to get together and agree on what you want to do around monitoring what you are doing. You have to be able to get together and agree around how do you share those learning lessons with us. And you have to be able to agree how do you, as funders, and in this case, because you can have all the money, but if you do not have the technical expertise from the NGOs and partners, you cannot spend that money. But what is your principle around who do you support and how do you support and how do you share those around? So it would really have to be how you monitor that, how do you learn quickly and share lessons learned, and in cases where there's conflict, how you deal with conflict. And lastly, Gail, I think the question around how do you also deal with power was quite clarified. I mean, as funders, we have to be very aware of the power or the perceived power that we bring in and constantly be mindful. We can't have the beneficiary or the partner organization be the one who is who shapes themselves, but we also have as funders to shape ourselves and remember that that power can build or break with whatever different interventions that you want to implement.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes more, and I'm very happy for the panel to continue.
I was actually going to talk about wrapping it up now.
We want to take some questions.
Yeah, okay.
But we've got about 10 minutes.
I was going to give the panel some time for closing comments, but let me take one or two questions that you may want to put to the panel before we close. No, so we've been talking about collaboration from different stakeholder perspectives, from governments, from funders of education, from non-profit organizations, and even within schools, and talking about the complexities. And I'm going to ask the panel to just make their closing comments. We started off talking about literacy being a burning platform, and we started off agreeing that collaboration was important, and we started off agreeing that reading, and I would say writing, are the fundamentals that we must focus on in primary school. And I just want to ask the panel to make some closing remarks around collaboration, complexities, enablers and hindrances. Can I start on your side, Mpumi?
So I'd say my closing comments are, I like the idea of having a shared understanding of the problem. We've had literacy issues in South Africa for a long time. I'm not convinced that we've always shared the problems we have, the depth, understanding the depth of the problem, how difficult change actually is, and at the same time, not having it an either or conversation, but having and we've been improving. So it is jointly possible that we are improving and yet we have very deep problems. And I think COVID has revealed that, but has also forced us to re-engage on that conversation, as opposed to seeing that as a deficit mindset, because it then becomes polarizing, right? We're either superstars or were terrible. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. So I think I appreciate that the moment we have is a moment to rethink about that. And once we have a shared understanding of the depth of the problem, to envisage how each of us can play a different role. Schooling has never needed as much help as it does today from outside the classroom. So when the day ends at 1 o'clock, the after-school programs that exist now need to be reinforced even more. And in a space of flexibility, an after-school program doesn't need to be teaching you the grade 6 curriculum at grade 6 time. It's not formal schooling time. So there's a lot of sort of going back to the basic skills that are missing and reinforcing that are now possible and encouraged. We have, I think, not been very successful in engaging and mobilizing parents at scale for the majority of quintile 1 to 3 schools to engage and play a role. I think we now have to innovate, think, create, and find spaces in which they can work. And I think lastly, appreciating that all those things are necessary, but they are not the same thing. A teacher has literacy skills that a parent doesn't have. They're not the same. And yet they can be complementary. So it doesn't have to be, if schooling's going correctly, teachers are teaching, then parents do nothing. Or parents should be the one that will change the system. It's probably a collaboration, largely lying in the classroom, which is our biggest investment. Teachers are there, learners are there, spending the majority of their time, but making sure that the supporting infrastructure is clear and it happens so that we can try and recover as much as possible. Thanks.
So if I go back to collaboration being the act of removing obstacles, I found this conversation so helpful to identify the constraints of government as a way of understanding one of the removal of obstacles. Like what not to do with government. It's actually just a great question to ask. And particularly the last comment from me about what happens after classroom time. I think it's such a great provocation. I just want to put it out there. And also not direct intervention from outside during classroom time. You know, like how do we work with those two constraints? And then I wanted to ask Andile to cover, if you don't mind, in your closing remarks, the way you described in like a minute or two, how you pivoted and elaborated around the COVID reality was like it needs to be written up as case study. Like there's something there that applied all of the collaboration principles, sharing power, quickly adjusting, learning about yourselves, giving feedback, what are we measuring together, etc. That all happened really well. But the question I have is, who held it together? Like, what was your governance structure in that collaboration? So that's me.
Okay, I'm going to start with who held it together. The emergency response is one of the core responsibilities for us at UNICEF, but government has the responsibility to ensure that there is a response for the system, for the 30 million learners Dube is talking about, and for the almost 80% who are in quintile 1, 2, and 3 who are poor children. So government has to coordinate. So when we are getting into interventions that are at that systemic level, the government has to be the leader, and as players, we have to play a supporting role to government, because therein lies how accountability and institutionalizing of the program would work. So we know that government is engaged in a day-to-day business of making sure that provision happens, teachers are paid, they respond to all the queries, but there also is the responsibility to say where there's emergency, the accountability still sits with government. And our role, as much as possible, is to provide technical support, to mobilize funding, to mobilize players, and to help with defining the strategies where there are no government strategies. So in this very case, the ultimate chair becomes government, and we become support to government, and institutionalization happens. And it helps the system in that schools and provinces and districts then do not get different letters and different directives from everyone else, but they get it from the central role, which is the system, and in this case, it becomes the Department of Basic Education. So that is how it's structured. But in closing, I think what I wanted to just talk to you is, we've already all agreed that collaboration in one way or the other is important, and we have to collaborate in a way it doesn't work, you actually can exit as well. We also have agreed that we need to be able to provide evidence that whatever we do will create some of the change, or under which conditions will work. For our case, evidence for us shows that if you improve literacy and numeracy, quality education is likely to improve. But we also know that that is not going to happen unless we sort out issues of care and support for teaching and learning. So you can imagine how much differences we might have when one comes from the curriculum perspective and one comes from care and support for learning. But how do we then bring this together, because both of them provide evidence of change, and change as a lever, and that is what for me is quite important. And I think that programs that we have worked with try to deal with the two. We also know that as stakeholders, we think about change differently. We think about systemic change differently, and then we have to respect that, particularly where evidence has been provided. I'm ignoring the note. So when we're thinking of, for me in closing, Gail, when we respect those different perspectives, and we know that we are here to support government in enriching those priorities, and we are here to support the children, then collaborations are going to be possible with all the complexities and with all the respect that we need to, and with all the trust and with all the communication. So let's keep on doing this together to maximize reach and then deepen impact in the system.
Thank you. And I've just realized there's a clock I can watch, so I don't have to watch Gail. So, 3 points. I think the first one is that at whichever level you're working, is a very important question if you want to collaborate, if you want to have partnerships. And that's the question, who can create blockages and who can unblock blockages? Once you've done that exercise at school level, or district, or circuit, or province, or whatever, you have to invest in communication to take people with you. I'll pause there and watch the clock. The second point that I've learned a lot about this year is you have to understand who else is working in this space so that we can align. And why that's so important is that, there's several NGOs, let's say, working in KZN who are working across the system. And we've tried to set up conversations so that we can align, not lose the integrity of what we're doing, but a simple thing like aligning language. So I'm going to use a conversation between VVOB and PILO. So we were talking about how important it is for a group of teachers under the leadership of a head of a department to plan, track, monitor, solve problems together. But we never used the word professional learning community. VVOB was slaving away, establishing professional. It's the same as what we were saying, but we weren't using that language. So we weren't reinforcing it. So if you work in the same space as somebody else, understand their language and as far as possible align. Because you know what happens with schools is that, well, with all of us, is you think, oh, now in VVOB, this is what we're doing. Oh, no, but you come forward with it, something else. But that coordination across is fundamentally if we can align language where possible. So it's not felt like a separate thing. And then my last point is just as we are individuals within an organization and in our organizations are individual organizations within a greater thing, we also need to remember that the schools we're interacting with are also have teachers who are not only individuals, they're also members of organizations. And we have invested a lot in getting unions to understand what we're doing. And they've been the greatest ally, both in design and in monitoring, because they're close to the ground. They know what was intended. They can see when what's coming across is not what was intended, and they can alert us. I'm not saying any of these things we've done perfectly, but those are the principles that inform. Thank you.
In closing, I must thank Latasa for giving us the platform to have this conversation. I think a lot of time we talk about the doing and really sit back and think about joining the dots, or in other words, how can we collaborate? I think this was an important conversation to start, and definitely something that we must take forward. I also want to thank the panelists. I think I twisted a lot of your arms to come and share your insights today, and thank you very much for participating and actually sharing some of your learnings with us. And thank you to you, the audience, for spending the time with us. Thank you.